Opening atmosphere of Blackridge. The first time I laid eyes on Blackridge, even from a distance, it felt less like arriving at a town and more like trespassing on a secret. The mountains loomed like watchful sentinels, their ancient slopes catching the last bruised streaks of daylight. Fog, thick and low, pooled in the valleys and crawled up the hillsides in sluggish coils, clinging to the land with a desperate intimacy, as if trying to hide it from the rest of the world. There was something about the way the sun dipped below the ridges too quickly, as though daylight here was being stolen, siphoned away before its natural time. Locals might shrug and blame geography, but I've been in mountain towns before. This was different. Blackridge's official population, 7,432 souls, seemed a strangely precise number for a place that felt so timeless, as if that figure had been carved into stone and guarded jealously against change. The air had the faint metallic tang of rain yet to fall, and the soundscape was oddly muted. No distant dogs barking, no kids playing in yards, no hammering from a carpenter's shop. Just the low hum of something unseen, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. Founded in 1801, the town bore its founder's name like an unbroken chain. And here was the first oddity since the incorporation of Blackridge. Every single mayor had carried the same surname, Blackridge. Over 2 centuries of governance elections had always ended the same way, regardless of challengers' political shifts or public dissent. On paper, this was painted as a proud tradition, a testament to leadership and civic duty. But in the silences between those public accounts, in the faintly uneasy glances people gave when the topic came up, there lingered the suggestion of something older and less wholesome, holding it all together. From the moment I arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town was a stage set for an audience I couldn't see. Every smile rehearsed, every handshake choreographed, every building restored just enough to seem alive without feeling entirely used. There are towns where history is celebrated, where it breathes alongside the present. In Blackridge, history wasn't celebrated. It was preserved, embalmed, and posed in a glass case for display. And like any relic, it demanded silence from those who stood before it. I told myself these impressions were just the romantic imaginings of a man prone to seeing patterns, that maybe I was looking too hard for the sinister. But deep down, I already knew this was no ordinary small town. This was a place that guarded something it didn't want the world to see, the catalyst, mysterious package. The first domino fell 3 months before I set foot in Blackridge. It arrived in the mail without fanfare, no return address, no postal markings beyond what was necessary. A simple brown paper package, weighty in the hand, the corners blunt with age. Inside was an object that smelled faintly of dust and something else I couldn't place at first, cedar maybe, or the ghost of an old library. I remember the sound it made when I unwrapped it, the slow crackle of aged leather flexing for the first time in years. The journal was bound in dark weather-worn hide, its edges frayed and softened by decades of handling. The paper inside had yellowed, some pages curling at the corners, others blotched with water stains or the smudged residue of hurried ink. Tucked inside the front cover was a note written in a steady but unadorned hand. Someone needs to know. No signature, no date. Just those 4 words, each one pressing like a fingertip against my mind. The name on the inside cover gave me pause. Eleanor Wright. I remembered the name vaguely from an old missing persons list I'd combed through while working on a different story years ago. She'd been a local historian in Blackridge, last seen in 1998. Officially, she'd moved away unexpectedly according to some municipal archive records. Unofficially, she had simply vanished. The journal was no idle collection of thoughts. It was a map, a ledger, a confession rolled into one. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, noted patterns spanning decades. Marginalia in the form of questions, warnings, and occasionally passages where her pen dug so hard into the paper it almost tore. Every 7 years, always someone alone, always the same family name in office. I read it once, then twice, each time feeling the edges of my skepticism wearing down. There was an urgency to her words, as though she'd been writing faster than her mind could process, desperate to capture details before someone intervened. That note, those pages, they weren't just information. They were a baton being passed mid-sprint. And whether I liked it or not, I'd just taken the handoff. Origins of Blackridge. Thaddeus Blackridge. The accepted history of Blackridge paints Thaddeus Blackridge as a man of vision, a charismatic leader, wealthy and educated, who left a comfortable life in Boston to carve out a new community in the wilderness. But Eleanor's journal suggested a much different origin story, one not of expansion and hope, but of obsession and something far older than the town itself. In her research, Eleanor found correspondence between Thaddeus and unnamed contacts likely in Europe, speaking cryptically of the convergence. The valley that would become Blackridge, according to these letters, wasn't chosen for fertile soil or proximity to trade routes. It was chosen because it was thin. Indigenous tribes had avoided it for generations, naming it in their oral histories as a place where the veil between worlds was fragile, where things crossed over that had no business in the human realm. The warnings were clear. Stay away, do not settle, do not disturb, not. But Thaddeus seemed drawn to the place with a fervor bordering on madness. He wrote of dreams filled with voices, of a call he could feel beneath the bones of the earth. Whether those voices were real or imagined, he followed them into the valley, bringing with him a group of settlers who either shared his vision or were too bound by loyalty to question it. The winter of 1801 was harsher than anyone expected. Temperatures plunged to record lows. Hunting failed, stored grain spoiled without explanation. Then in January 1802 came the first disappearance, Mary Holloway, a young woman of 19. The official record would later claim she was taken by wolves. But whispers, handed down through the years, told a different story, that she'd been invited to dine with Thaddeus himself and never left his home. By spring, Thaddeus had been named mayor in a unanimous vote. Those who had opposed him in the early months were gone. Some dead, some simply vanished, and from that spring forward, the town's fortunes began to rise in ways that defied logic. Crops flourished despite poor weather, livestock multiplied beyond natural limits, and the first faint trace of a pattern emerged, one that would repeat itself for generations. The first disappearance and rise to power. Mary Holloway's name still appears in the oldest municipal ledger of Blackridge, January 14th. 1802, though the entry is only a single line, missing, presumed taken by wolves. No search party records, no burial, no family testimony. It's as if her existence was reduced to an inconvenience, neatly recorded and filed away. But Eleanor Wright's notes added what official history left out. The story whispered among the descendants of those first settlers went like this. Mary had been invited to dine at Thaddeus Blackridge's home on a bitterly cold evening. She had wrapped herself in her best wool shawl, one her mother had embroidered with small flowers. Several people saw her walk up the frost-hardened path to the mayor's residence, though at the time Thaddeus had not yet formally been given that title. Hours later, a light snow began to fall. By morning, her bed in the Holloway cabin had not been slept in. When questions arose, Thaddeus was calm, almost rehearsed. Mary had thanked him for supper and left before the snow began. He suggested perhaps she'd taken the shortcut through the woods and been surprised by a wolf pack. By the end of the week, the official explanation was set in ink, and any voices of dissent had gone strangely quiet. It was around this time that the settlement, struggling through its first winter with dwindling supplies, turned to choosing a leader to guide them through the hardship. The vote for mayor was unanimous. The man who had inexplicably retained fresh food in his stores while others rationed scraps became the obvious choice. Eleanor noted in her journal that several of the men who had initially resisted Thaddeus's influence were no longer present by spring. Some had decided to return east according to official records, though no caravan logs confirmed their departure. Others were found dead of exposure in the woods, odd given they were experienced frontiersmen. What followed that spring was nothing short of miraculous to the townspeople. Crops planted in the thaw grew faster than expected. The livestock that had barely survived the winter produced abundant offspring, and the memory of Mary Holloway faded into the background, one tragedy among many in the wilderness. But this miracle marked the beginning of a grim cycle. Every 7 years, someone would vanish without explanation. And each time, the prosperity that followed seemed almost calculated, as though someone or something were keeping careful accounts. The generational pattern. If Blackridge had been just another prosperous small town, the unbroken line of Blackridge mayors might have been considered a charming quirk of local politics. But Eleanor's meticulous mapping of dates and events revealed something far too precise to be chance. She had spent years assembling census records, obituaries, land deeds, and missing persons reports. Layered together, they formed what she called a horrible symmetry. Every 7 years, like clockwork, someone disappeared. The victims fit a pattern, rarely married, no close family, often newcomers to the area. And with each disappearance, the town seemed to flourish anew. Droughts that crippled neighboring communities barely grazed Blackridge. Epidemics that swept through the county skipped over its residents. Business ventures thrived even when market conditions suggested they should fail. Eleanor wasn't the first to notice. Over the decades, a few outsiders had remarked on the strange coincidence, reporters, traveling merchants, even a census worker in the early 1900s. But none stayed long enough to dig deeper, and those who tried left abruptly, their work unfinished. The succession of mayors was equally flawless. When a Blackridge died, another took their place without serious opposition. In some cases, an election was little more than a formality announced in the Weekly Gazette. It wasn't just that the family retained power, it was that no one ever seemed willing or able to challenge them. Eleanor's notes were blunt. This is not politics. This is a system of exchange. The prosperity was purchased, the disappearances were the price. And the Blackridge family at the center of it all was both the collector and the beneficiary. Eleanor's final entry and skepticism turned belief. Eleanor's last journal entry before her disappearance was dated April 17, 1998. In it, she wrote, "I believe I found the location where the rituals take place. Tomorrow night I intend to witness it for myself." That sentence alone might have been dismissed as the fevered imagination of a local eccentric if it weren't for the corroborating evidence I found in her earlier pages. She had pinpointed the dates of disappearances, going back to the founding of the town, all separated by exactly 7 years. And now the next date was fast approaching. When I began my own review of her research, I did so as a skeptic. Stories of supernatural pacts and ritual sacrifice sound like the plot lines of pulp horror, not something grounded in historical fact. But each time I checked her sources, official police records, archived newspaper reports, missing persons lists, I found her claims disturbingly accurate. It was a photograph that finally unsettled me. In the archives of a county paper, I found a portrait of Mayor Elias Blackridge dated 1861. The face was unmistakable save for clothing and hairstyle. It could have been a photograph of the current mayor, Sylvia Blackridge. The same sharp jawline, the same gray eyes, the same faint, almost imperceptible tilt to the head. And then there was my own discovery, something Eleanor had missed. Using modern satellite imaging and topographical data, I noticed that Blackridge sits dead center within a ring of 7 surrounding mountain peaks. The alignment was geometric precise beyond anything nature could have arranged. From above, it looked almost like a sigil carved into the earth itself. That was the moment I stopped doubting her. Whatever was happening here wasn't folklore. It was design, and designs always have an architect. First visit to Blackridge. 3 weeks ago, I wound my way up the narrow mountain road that led to Blackridge. The journey itself felt like a threshold, crossing the kind of road where the air changes halfway up and the sky seems to hold its breath. The last mile was flanked by trees so dense they formed a canopy blotting out the daylight and making the headlights unnecessary, but instinctively comforting. When I emerged from the tree line, the town revealed itself in one careful breath, as though it had been waiting. Blackridge was beautiful, picturesque in the way old postcards are. Main Street lined with 2-story Victorian facades, painted in muted earth tones, each one meticulously maintained their windows polished to a soft gleam. The clock tower over the municipal building still kept perfect time. In the square stood a statue of Thaddeus Blackridge, the founder, carved from weathered granite. His stance was commanding, his stone eyes sharp and calculating. And then there was Blackridge Manor. Rising from the north end of town like a monarch surveying its domain, the house was an imposing expanse of stone and steep roofs. Dark shutters framed tall windows, and ivy crept up the walls like veins. Every mayor for over 2 centuries had lived there, and now it was home to Mayor Sylvia Blackridge. Under the pretense of writing an article on historic small-town governance, I arranged an interview with her. In person, Sylvia was striking tall with an air of cultivated composure. Her white hair was cut sharply, her gray eyes unwavering. She spoke of tradition, of civic pride, of the Blackridge family's dedication to preserving Blackridge's way of life. Her words were polished, her smile practiced. But when I asked about the disappearances, something shifted. Her eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly, the warmth in her voice cooling a few degrees. "Every town has its tragedies," she said evenly. "Urban legends are a distraction from the real work of building a community." The conversation ended shortly after. As I rose to leave, I glanced at her secretary's desk. A desk calendar sat open, its pages neat and orderly, except for one date circled in thick red ink, April 17th, 2025. It was exactly 7 years since the last recorded disappearance in Blackridge. Innkeeper's warning. I had booked a room at the Blackridge Inn, a cozy bed and breakfast run by a middle-aged couple, the Harrises. They were genial, the kind of hosts who served fresh muffins with breakfast and asked just enough questions to seem polite without prying. Over dinner that night they spoke warmly of the town, its festivals, its close-knit community, its unbroken traditions. There was no mention of disappearances, no whispers of strange events. Later, as I returned to my room, I passed the hallway that led to the kitchen and overheard Mrs. Harris speaking on the phone. Her voice was low, urgent, stripped of the friendliness she'd shown earlier. "He's asking questions about the Blackridge family." "No, I didn't tell him anything." "Yes, I understand what happens to people who talk. We'll be going to my sister's for the weekend, just like you suggested." When I entered the dining room for breakfast the next morning, the mood had changed. Mr. Harris explained somewhat apologetically that they'd had a family emergency and would be closing the inn for several days. He suggested I find lodging at a small roadside motel on the outskirts of town. Their eyes didn't quite meet mine as they handed back my room key. I couldn't tell if their urgency was born of genuine fear or something more sinister, but I understood the subtext. I was no longer welcome under their roof. Library visit and archive discovery. With no fixed lodging for the night, I decided to use the day to search for more of Eleanor Wright's research. The Blackridge Library was a handsome brick building, its carved wooden sign boasting established 1844. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the light filtered through high windows in dusty beams. The librarian Parker was an elderly man whose stooped frame and soft voice suggested a life lived in quiet routine. When I asked about Eleanor, his eyes flickered with something recognition, perhaps discomfort. Eleanor was troubled, he said finally. Brilliant, but she became obsessed with old legends. Started seeing patterns where there weren't any. Shame what happened to her. When I asked exactly what had happened, he claimed she had moved away, suddenly offering no further detail. I knew this contradicted the missing persons report I'd read, but I didn't press. Instead, I wandered the aisles until I found the local history section shockingly sparse for a town with over 2 centuries of continuity. Books on architecture, economic growth, prominent citizens, but nothing of substance about the Blackridge family itself. As I turned to leave, I noticed a door marked Archives, Staff Only. Parker had disappeared into a back room minutes earlier. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, I slipped inside. The archives were far richer than the public shelves, rows of boxes, filing cabinets, and even a pair of old microfiche readers. On a central table lay a spread of materials. Newspaper clippings about disappearances dating back decades, a map with pins marking locations, and a notebook in fresh handwriting. Someone recently had been tracking the same patterns Eleanor had. I photographed everything I could before slipping out through a side door just as Parker's footsteps approached. Back on the street, I caught sight of a black sedan idling across from the library, the same car I'd seen earlier that morning. Its tinted windows reflected the overcast sky, revealing nothing of the person inside. But I could feel it. I was no longer just an observer in Blackridge. I was being observed. Historical Society. Encounter the Blackridge. Historical Society occupied one of the oldest buildings in town, a narrow 3-story brick structure with a bell-shaped cupola and an arched front door flanked by gas-style lanterns. Inside, the air smelled faintly of beeswax polish and paper so old it seemed to crumble in your imagination. The walls were lined with sepia-toned photographs, town founders in stiff collars, grainy shots of parades, and rows of Blackridge mayors, through the decades their grey eyes eerily consistent. The curator, Meredith Chambers, was in her early 30s, dressed in a vintage wool skirt and a cream blouse buttoned to the throat. She greeted me warmly, her voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm you only get from someone who truly loves their subject. At first, she seemed eager to share, gesturing toward glass cases, holding old maps, municipal charters, and ceremonial keys to the town. But when I began steering the conversation toward the Blackridge family's personal history, the warmth evaporated. The Blackridges have always been very private people, she said, her tone crisp, now less friendly. She explained that most of the family's personal effects were still kept at Blackridge Manor, inaccessible to the public. I mentioned the pattern of disappearances, phrasing it casually as if I were simply curious about town folklore. Meredith's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I think you should be careful about the kind of story you're trying to write, Mr. Sullivan," she said. The fact that she knew my name stopped me cold. I hadn't given it. Her voice softened, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Blackridge is a close-knit community. We look after our own, and we don't appreciate outsiders coming here to sensationalize tragedies for clicks and views. When I stepped outside, a black sedan was parked across the street, engine running. I didn't have to see the driver to know it was the same car from the library. This time, as I walked away, it pulled out and followed at a slow, deliberate pace, meeting Raymond Cooper. I lost the sedan briefly by ducking through residential streets, eventually stopping in a small coffee shop called The Daily Grind. The barista, a young woman with quick hands and a nervous smile, served me black coffee in a chipped mug. As I chatted casually, I mentioned I was researching the town's history. Her eyes lit up, not with suspicion, but with opportunity. "You should talk to my grandfather," she said. "He's 92, been here his whole life, knows all the old stories." She scribbled an address on a napkin. Salty Maple Street. Raymond Cooper lived in a modest bungalow with a wide front porch, the kind that sagged slightly from decades of seasons. He answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane, but his eyes, sharp, intelligent, took me in at once. When I mentioned Eleanor Wright's name, he opened the door wider without hesitation. Inside, his living room walls were covered with photographs. Blackridge through the decades, from muddy main streets to modern-day storefronts. He poured tea into mismatched cups and settled into a worn armchair. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," he said. "Eleanor was the last one who did. We were friends. I helped her with her research when I could." Raymond confirmed Eleanor's findings in precise, deliberate detail: the 7-year disappearances, the unbroken line of Blackridge mayors, the town's uncanny prosperity. Then he added something Eleanor hadn't documented: a secondary pattern. Anyone who opposes a Blackridge loses something precious, always without fail. His voice trembled as he told me about 1953, when his father ran against Mayor Conrad Blackridge. A week before the election, Raymond's little sister vanished from the school playground. The police chief, a cousin of Conrad, suggested his father withdraw to focus on the family crisis. His father did. His sister was never found. The true origin and ritual, purpose. From beneath his sofa, Raymond pulled out a weathered box tied with twine. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, diary excerpts, materials even Eleanor hadn't found. He spread them on the coffee table, hands shaking. One map was marked with a red X deep in the woods north of town. Eleanor found something there, he said. Something that confirmed her worst suspicions. She had called him the night before she vanished, claiming she had proof of what the Blackridge family was really doing. She never made it to their meeting the next morning. According to Raymond, the red X marked an ancient stone circle predating European settlement. Local indigenous legends described it as a doorway to the realm of spirits. Thaddeus Blackridge, he said, hadn't simply stumbled upon the valley, he had sought it out, deliberately corresponding with European occultists who believed the site could grant enormous power to whoever controlled it. The ritual, Raymond explained, required blood sacrifice at regular intervals. This was the price for the town's health, prosperity, and unnatural abundance. But there was more. The sacrifices weren't just about feeding whatever dwelled beneath the circle, they were about maintaining the Blackridge line itself. In his words, the mayors aren't just family. They're the same person. Thaddeus never died. He moves from body to body, taking a new host every few decades. Before I could press for more, Raymond's phone rang. He answered, listening for a moment before his face turned pale. "You need to leave now," he said. "There's a black car parked down the street. Men are watching my house. They know you're here. Urgency. And the cabin. Key." Raymond's hands shook as he rummaged through a drawer, scattering pens and brittle scraps of paper, until he found a small tarnished brass key. He pressed it into my palm with the weight of something far more dangerous than metal. "This is to Eleanor's cabin in the woods," he said. "She left it with me for safekeeping. Whatever she found, whatever proof she had, it might still be there." I glanced toward the curtained window. The black sedan sat motionless at the far end of the street, its tinted windshield a perfect mirror for the gray afternoon sky. I couldn't see the driver, but the stillness of the car felt deliberate, predatory. "You can't go back to your inn," Raymond continued. "They'll be watching. Take the back alleys to the edge of town, then head north until you hit the old logging road. It's overgrown, but you'll find the trailhead on the left. The cabin is about a mile in." There was a heaviness in his voice, a note of something unspoken. I asked if he'd ever been there himself. His eyes flickered to the map still spread on the table, then back to mine. "Once. I didn't stay long. The woods. They feel wrong up there. Like the air doesn't belong to you." Before I could ask more, his phone rang again. He didn't answer this time, just glanced at the caller ID and muttered, "Too late." A pair of headlights swept briefly across the room as a second car slowed outside. Raymond moved quickly for a man his age, ushering me toward the back door. "Go," he urged. "And listen to me, the 17th is only 2 days away. If you wait, you'll be too late. Or worse." Discovery at Eleanor's cabin. The road north wound into increasingly dense forest, the afternoon light thinning until it seemed more twilight than day. At the trailhead, I parked behind a wall of tangled undergrowth, leaving no clear line of sight from the road. The trail was overgrown, marked only by faint depressions where feet had once passed. When I finally spotted the cabin through the trees, it looked less like a home and more like a memory, small single-story, its weathered boards silvered by decades of rain and frost. Moss crawled up the walls, and the roof sagged in the middle like an old man's spine. The brass key fit perfectly in the lock. The door groaned as it swung inward, releasing a breath of air stale with disuse. Dust lay thick over every surface. A bed with a collapsed mattress slumped against the far wall. A narrow desk sat beneath a shuttered window, its drawers swollen shut from years of humidity. I searched methodically. Under a loose floorboard near the desk, my fingers found the edge of a metal box. Inside a newer journal, Eleanor's handwriting unmistakable, and a small cloth bag tied with red thread. The journal's entries picked up where the leather-bound one had left off, her tone sharper, more urgent. She described finding the stone circle, watching preparations for something she called the offering, and her growing certainty that the Blackridge family was not entirely human. The cloth bag contained an object wrapped in silk, a small stone figurine, its surface worn, smooth, its carved eyes deep and hollow. Even without knowing what it was, I felt a pulse of wrongness radiating from it, like holding a fragment of something that should never have been touched. Final journal revelations. The more I read of Eleanor's final entries, the clearer the horror became. The Blackridge mayors were not a bloodline in the human sense, they were vessels. Thaddeus Blackridge had never truly died. His consciousness, or something far older that had fused with him, moved from host to host. Each transfer required a sacrifice, and the chosen victim was always someone without ties, someone whose absence would not be immediately noticed. In Eleanor's words, the eyes give it away, always the same gray regardless of the host's original color, always that unblinking stare. She described watching the previous mayor, Evelyn Blackridge, in the weeks before her death, how her movements grew slower, her gaze more vacant. Then, after the transfer to Sylvia, Evelyn's eyes dulled to brown, her posture slack as if waking from a half-century sleep. The figurine Eleanor believed was a fragment of the entity itself, calcified into the physical world. It could be used to open the doorway beneath the stone circle or to seal it permanently. But sealing it came at a cost. Whoever performed the act would be pulled through as the connection collapsed. Her last entry was dated the day before she vanished. Tomorrow I will take the figurine to the circle. If I do not return, know that I tried. The Blackridge hold on this town must end. I set the journal down, the figurine heavy in my palm. Outside, the forest was silent, not the quiet of peace, but of expectation. Somewhere out there, the stone circle waited. And the 17th was coming fast, approaching the stone circle. I left the cabin just before dusk, the figurine tucked into my jacket pocket, its weight feeling far greater than its size could account for. According to Eleanor's map, the stone circle lay about a mile deeper into the forest, but the path was more suggestion than trail. Twisted roots clawed at my boots, and the branches above interlaced so tightly that what little sunlight remained seeped through in fractured shards. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change. Cooler, heavier, charged like the moment before a storm. My footsteps, though muffled by damp earth and last year's leaves, sounded unnaturally loud. The forest had gone completely still. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, just my breathing and the faint thud of my heartbeat in my ears. When I finally saw it, I understood why Eleanor had called this place wrong. The clearing was a perfect circle, its edges sharply defined as though drawn with a compass. Waist-high stones ringed the space, each one weathered yet unbroken, their surfaces etched with lines that looked almost like writing, though the symbols shifted subtly when I tried to focus on them. Inside the circle, the ground was a lush, impossible green, despite the early spring. Beyond the boundary, the forest floor remained a tangle of dead leaves and brittle underbrush. It was as if the seasons obeyed a different law inside the stones. I found a spot in the undergrowth where I could conceal myself and set up my camera on a tripod. The figurine pulsed faintly against my ribs, and I could swear the carvings on its face were deeper than they had been when I first saw them. I checked my watch an hour until full dark. All that was left to do was wait, procession, and preparation. The first sign of movement came with the crunch of leaves under measured footsteps. The sound was deliberate, unhurried, as though the approaching group had no reason to fear being discovered. Through the dim light, I saw them, a procession of figures dressed in dark clothing moving single file toward the clearing. At the front walked Sylvia Blackridge, still in the same tailored black suit she had worn during our interview. The waning light made her white hair gleam like a crown, but her expression was utterly devoid of warmth. Behind her came a dozen others' faces I recognized from the town square, the library, the historical society. Parker, the librarian, Meredith, the curator, even the police chief. Last in line was a young man I knew only vaguely, the assistant from the Daily Grind coffee shop. His gait was stiff, his expression blank, his eyes unfocused. Two large men flanked him, each with a hand resting lightly but firmly on his arm. The group formed a wide ring around the standing stones, leaving a path open for Sylvia, who stepped into the center. Her voice, when she spoke, carried unnaturally well through the still air. For 224 years, we have kept the covenant. For 224 years, we have prospered. Now we honor the pact again, as our forebears did before us. At her words, the others began to chant in a low rhythmic language I couldn't recognize. The sound was both melodic and discordant, as though two different melodies were being sung at once. The young man was guided forward until he stood beside Sylvia, his vacant gaze fixed somewhere beyond the stones. Entity's arrival. The glow began subtly, just a faint phosphorescence emanating from the ground at the center of the circle. Then it swelled, flooding the clearing with a greenish-gold light that seemed to bend the air itself. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and Sylvia's own shadow twisted and writhed, moving independently from her body. I could feel the air thickening, pressing against my skin, as if the atmosphere itself were being drawn inward. Then, without warning, the space inside the stone seemed to fold in on itself. It wasn't like watching something appear. It was like reality itself was being pulled back to reveal what lay beneath. Through the distortion, I caught glimpses of something. It was vast, wrong, and impossible to describe in human terms. A form built of angles that refused to stay still, of shadows that bled into light. It reached forward not with limbs, but with a pull I could feel in my chest, a gravity that wanted to drag everything closer. The young man didn't scream. He didn't even blink. His body seemed to dissolve into motes of shadow and light absorbed into the distortion until there was nothing left. The glow flared once, then dimmed as the rift began to close. Sylvia collapsed to her knees, her body shuddering. The chant changed lower, steadier, almost soothing. When she stood again, her movements were jerky, unnatural. Her eyes had changed too, now bearing that same hollow gray I had seen in the portraits of Thaddeus Blackridge. And then I noticed Evelyn Blackridge standing just beyond the stones, her once gray eyes now muddy brown, her face slack with confusion. Something had shifted. Something had gone wrong. Exposure and chase. It happened so quickly I barely registered it. A shift in movement within the circle Evelyn's eyes, finding mine in the underbrush. They widened not in recognition of me, but in some instinctive awareness that I did not belong here. She mouthed something, her lips forming the words, "Help me." That tiny motion was enough. The police chief's head snapped in my direction. He barked an order and the chanting ceased as if someone had cut a wire. Dozens of eyes turned toward me at once, gray, hollow, unblinking. The air inside the clearing seemed to shudder. My pulse surged, every instinct screaming at me to run. I grabbed my camera, yanked it from the tripod, and tore through the undergrowth. The first shouts rang out behind me, commands, curses, the crack of branches as they gave chase. The forest became a blur of dark shapes and cold air whipping past my face. My boots slipped in patches of damp leaves, my lungs burning with each breath. Somewhere behind me, a flashlight beam flared briefly, followed by another. They were fanning out, herding me toward something or away from something. I doubled back twice, trying to lose them, but the voices didn't fade. Every time I thought I'd broken away, a branch would snap somewhere too close, or a breathless shout would ripple through the darkness. My only thought was distance, put as much between myself and the stone circle as possible. When I saw the faint outline of Eleanor's cabin through the trees, I sprinted for it. Inside, I slammed the door and dragged a heavy table against it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the legs. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my camera. I had footage. Proof. Then I noticed it, the figurine on the desk where I'd left it. It was warm now. Too warm. Thin lines of dark liquid trickled from the hollowed eyes, dripping onto the wood. Outside, the voices were drawing nearer. They knew exactly where I was. Evelyn's choice. I slipped out the cabin's back window just as the front door shuddered under a heavy blow. My boots hit the ground silently on the damp earth, and I took off in the opposite direction of the voices, the figurine clenched in one hand, the camera strap wound tight around the other. The forest ahead began to thin, and through the tangle of branches, I saw her Evelyn Blackridge standing alone at the edge of the stone circle. Her face was pale but resolute, the confusion I'd seen earlier replaced by grim determination. When she saw me, she stepped forward quickly, her voice low but urgent. I remember everything now. 50 years of watching through my own eyes as something else controlled my body. 50 years of screaming inside my own head. She reached out, her fingers closing around my arm with surprising strength. "You have the figurine, don't you?" Eleanor told me about it before they took her. I hesitated. Eleanor's final warning echoed in my mind. Whoever seals the doorway will be drawn through as it closes. I couldn't ask this woman who had already lost half a century of her life to make that sacrifice. "I'll do it," I said, pressing the camera into her hands instead. "Get to my car. North Trailhead. Keys under the front wheel well. Get this evidence out. Make sure the world knows." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "They won't let me leave alive. I've been their prisoner for 50 years. Let me choose how it ends." Before I could answer, shouts erupted from the trees. Flashlights cut through the darkness. The police chief emerged first, gun drawn, and behind him came Sylvia Blackridge, her movements jerky, her eyes black pits in the pale oval of her face, breaking the pact. Evelyn snatched the figurine from my hand and turned toward the center of the circle. The ground beneath the stones was already beginning to glow, responding to the artifact's presence. "Run!" she shouted over her shoulder. Get the camera out. Tell our story." The police chief raised his gun. I dove sideways into the underbrush as a shot cracked the air. Sylvia let out a scream that wasn't human, a high, keening wail that made the trees vibrate. Evelyn reached the center. Stone lifted the figurine high and brought it down with a force that belied her age. It shattered on impact, the sound like a thunderclap in my skull. Light exploded outward, blinding and searing, while the air around us seemed to tear apart. From the rift that opened rose a shape that defied description, a writhing mass of shadow and fractured geometry, tendrils of light spilling from angles that shouldn't exist. It reached for Sylvia, whose body convulsed as black fluid streamed from her eyes and mouth. Evelyn stood firm in the center arms, outstretched, her face serene amid the chaos. The entity's tendrils wrapped around her, pulling her closer to the heart of the distortion. She looked at me one last time and nodded. I ran. Behind me, the ground shook violently, the air roaring with a sound that was part wind, part tearing fabric, part something I could only feel in my bones. And then silence. When I dared to look back, the stone circle was gone. Escape and aftermath. I didn't stop running until the forest gave way to the faint ribbon of the trailhead road. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my ears still rang from the blast of light and sound that had swallowed the stone circle. In my hands, the camera felt like both salvation and a curse, proof of what I had seen, and a weight that might make me the next target. When I reached my car, the air was still unnaturally so. No crickets, no wind, no sound of distant engines, just silence. I shoved the camera into the passenger seat, started the engine, and floored it down the twisting mountain road, not daring to glance in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. When I finally looked, my breath caught. Behind me, piercing the night sky like a column of fire, was a beam of pale, unearthly light rising from the direction of the forest. It pulsed faintly, then flickered and vanished, leaving only darkness in its wake. 3 weeks have passed since that night. In that time, I've scoured news outlets, police reports, and local bulletins for any mention of Blackridge. Nothing. The closest thing I've found is a short, easily missed article about a localized sinkhole in a wooded area, prompting the evacuation of several rural homes. No names, no fatalities, no mention of a town at all. When I tried calling Raymond Cooper, the number was disconnected. Directory assistants claimed there had never been a listing under that name. Maps I'd used to navigate to Blackridge now show nothing but blank terrain in its place, folded into the boundary of a neighboring county as if it had never existed. Sometimes I wonder if that's what happens when a place like Blackridge loses the thing that anchored it. Without the entity's presence, maybe the town simply unravels. Or maybe something decided the best way to hide the truth was to erase the town entirely. But erasing a place from paper is one thing. Erasing what happened there from the people who lived it, that's another. And I can't shake the feeling that someone somewhere still remembers. Closing warning. I've been in hiding since the night I left the mountains. I've backed up the footage to multiple encrypted drives, sent copies of Eleanor's research and Raymond's evidence to trusted contacts, and written this account in as much detail as I can recall. I'm releasing it now because I don't know how much time I have. Twice in the past week, I've seen a black sedan idling near the places I've been staying. Once I thought I spotted Meredith Chambers standing across the street watching my apartment. And 2 nights ago, I dreamed of the stone circle. Not as it was before, but as it is now collapsed, its stones shattered, the ground cracked and bleeding light. In the dream, a voice whispered my name and told me I had unfinished business. I want to believe Evelyn's sacrifice sealed the rift, banishing the thing that had lived beneath Blackridge for more than 2 centuries. But belief doesn't quiet the feeling I get just before I fall asleep. That weight in the air, that slow, patient presence, waiting for me to close my eyes. So I'm leaving you with this: check your own town's history. Look for patterns of prosperity amid tragedies that no one talks about. Pay attention to surnames that appear again and again in public office. And most of all, watch the eyes, the same unblinking gray, passed from face to face over generations. If you live somewhere where every mayor has borne the same surname for as long as anyone can remember, ask yourself what price is being paid for your community's good fortune. And if you start to find answers, make sure you get them out before someone makes sure you can't. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Sleep well if you can.